Bashar al-Assad's ascent to power is a story woven through the fabric of Syria's complex history, marked by the intertwining of familial legacy, political maneuvering, and the chaotic backdrop of regional and global geopolitics. Born in 1965 in Damascus, Bashar was the second son of Hafez al-Assad, the long-standing president who ruled Syria with an iron fist from 1971 until his death in 2000. Initially, Bashar's path was not one of politics. He was groomed for a career in medicine. He studied ophthalmology in the United Kingdom, seemingly destined to follow a life of healing rather than ruling. However, the unexpected death of his older brother, Bassel, in a car accident shifted the trajectory of his life. The regime needed a successor, and Bashar, with his Western education and polished demeanor, was thrust into the political spotlight. Upon Hafez al-Assad's death, Bashar was quickly elevated to the presidency, a position he assumed at the young age of 34. His rise was met with cautious optimism among some Syrians and the international community. He was perceived as a potential reformer, someone who might usher in a new era of openness and modernization. Early in his presidency, Bashar initiated a series of economic reforms aimed at liberalizing the economy, reducing state control, and encouraging private enterprise. This period, often referred to as the Damascus Spring, saw a brief flourishing of civil society, with intellectuals and activists daring to discuss political issues and advocate for change. However, this initial wave of reform was short-lived. The regime's inherent authoritarian nature quickly reasserted itself, stifling dissent and curtailing freedoms. Bashar's promise of reform was overshadowed by his heavy-handed approach to opposition. The illusion of change faded as the government cracked down on dissenters, and the political landscape returned to one marked by fear and repression. The seeds of discontent were sown, and the populace grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of genuine reform and the pervasive corruption that plagued the regime. The turning point came in 2011, amidst the wave of uprisings that swept across the Arab world. Inspired by movements in Tunisia and Egypt, Syrians took to the streets, demanding political reforms, an end to corruption, and greater freedoms. Initially, Bashar's response was dismissive. He underestimated the scale and fervor of the protests. However, as demonstrations intensified, so did the regime's brutal crackdown. Security forces were unleashed on protesters, leading to violent confrontations that resulted in numerous deaths. The government's response was not just a show of force, but a systematic attempt to crush the uprising, leading to a significant escalation of violence. As the protests morphed into an armed rebellion, Syria descended into a brutal civil war. The conflict drew in various domestic and international actors, transforming what began as a popular uprising into a multifaceted war involving regional powers, jihadist groups, and foreign interventions. Bashar's regime relied heavily on military might and support from allies, notably Russia and Iran, to maintain its grip on power. The Syrian military, bolstered by foreign fighters and militias, unleashed devastating assaults on opposition-held areas, leading to widespread destruction and a humanitarian catastrophe. The war not only ravaged the country, but also reshaped Assad's image from a potential reformer to a ruthless dictator. The use of chemical weapons against civilians, indiscriminate bombings, and the targeting of hospitals became hallmarks of his regime's strategy to quash dissent. The international community was horrified, but responses were often tepid and inconsistent. While some nations called for Assad to step down, others, including Russia and Iran, provided crucial support, viewing the regime as a bulwark against extremism and a key player in the region. As the years dragged on, Assad's hold on power solidified, albeit at a staggering cost. The war had displaced millions, created a refugee crisis that extended far beyond Syria's borders and left the country in ruins. Cities that once thrived were reduced to rubble, and the population was fractured along sectarian lines. Despite the devastation, Assad managed to regain control over significant portions of the country, aided by the military might of his allies and the fragmentation of opposition forces. By the mid-2010s, Assad's regime had transitioned from a position of vulnerability to one of relative stability, albeit precarious. The war had transformed him into a figure of resilience in the eyes of some, a leader who had withstood both internal and external pressures. Yet this facade of strength was built on a foundation of fear and repression. The regime's survival hinged not on popular support, but on a network of loyalty and coercion, as well as the backing of powerful allies. The fall of Assad, once a distant possibility, seemed increasingly unlikely. His regime had adapted to the shifting dynamics of the war, employing a strategy of attrition that exhausted opposition forces and consolidated control over key territories. However, the scars of the conflict ran deep, and the future of Syria remained uncertain. The war had not only decimated the country, but had also left behind a legacy of bitterness and division that would take generations to heal. In the aftermath of the conflict, the question of Assad's legitimacy loomed large. While he had managed to maintain power, the cost had been exorbitant. The international community remained divided, with some countries recognizing his government, while others continued to call for accountability for war crimes. The Syrian people, weary from years of violence and suffering, faced an uncertain future, grappling with the consequences of a regime that had evolved from a seemingly benign leadership into a symbol of tyranny. Bashar al-Assad's journey from doctor to dictator encapsulates the complexities of power, the fragility of reform, and the devastating consequences of unchecked authority. His story is not merely one of personal ambition, but a reflection of a nation caught in the throes of conflict, where hope for change was eclipsed by the harsh realities of war and oppression. As Syria continues to navigate its tumultuous path forward, the legacy of Assad's rule serves as a stark reminder of the perils of absolute power and the enduring quest for freedom and justice.